Ben bugün bizle beraber olduğunuz için hepinize çok teşekkür ederek başlamak istiyorum. Çünkü uzun bir aradan sonra yaklaşık 2-2,5 yıl gibi Ağrı'da kapılarımızı açtığımız ilk gün diyebilirim herkese. Bugünün tabii çok önemli destekçileri var, bugünün gerçekleşmesini sağlayan. Ama tabii ki ben bugünün içerikle ilgili konuşmalarına geçmeden önce etkinliğimizin sponsoru Diobo'ya teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Bizi 3 yıldır destekledikleri için. Ve onlarla ilgili kısa bir tanıtım videosuyla başlayacağız. Ardından sözü Ağrı İstanbul'un kurucu üyelerinden Sinizli'ye vereceğim. Teşekkürler.
...1927 yılında küçük bir mağazayla başlayan yolculuğumuz her geçen gün gelişerek devam etti. Çok yol kat ettik bugüne kadar. İnsana değer dedik. İnsan kaynağımızla bilim, birlik ve başarı meşalemizin ışığında renk olduk. Müşterilerimizle renkler içinde bir bütün olduk. Etik duruşumuzla her coğrafyada sosyal, politik ve kültürel değerlere saygı gösterdik. Bugün Mısır ve Rusya fabrikalarımızla güçlenerek insanoğluna bahşedilmiş renkli yeryüzünün olanaklarını farklı coğrafyalara yaymaya çalışıyoruz. Çevreye ve doğaya değer dedik. Mükemmellik anlayışımızın temelini teknoloji ve gelişime, insan kaynağımıza, sürdürülebilir iş modelimize ve dünya standartlarına kayıt anlayışına dayandırdık. Bu inançla, bu tutkuyla ürettik. Boya sektöründe ilk yerli üretici olmanın gururunu ve sorumluluğunu hep taşıdık. Bu yüzden daima kaliteli, yenilikçi ve sürdürülebilir dünya standartlarında bir marka olmayı hedefledik. Çalışanımıza değer dedik. Bugün 1100 çalışanımızla büyüdük. Kimya sektöründe en iyi ARGE merkezi ödülünü tam 3 kez aldık. Mükemmellik yolculuğunda 2013 yılında 5 yıldız yetkinlik belgesini aldık. 2014 yılında Ege bölgesinin en mükemmel şirketi seçildi. Mükemmellik yolculuğumuz hiç bitmeyecek. Bu topraklara değer dedik. Bayi ağımızla ülkenin sınırlarını aştık. Ürün kalitemizle, sistem belgelerimizle öncü olduk. Biz bugün dekoratif, mobilya, sanayi, ototamir, toz, deniz boyaları, polyester ve protektif boyalarla yaşamın her alanında varız. Akademimizde ulusal yeterliliklere göre belgelendirme yapıyor, sosyal sorumluluklarımızla da geleceğimize değer katıyoruz. Yaşamın, dünyayı, geleceği biz bugünden belirlendiriyoruz.
Dinlediğiniz için teşekkürler. Şimdi I'd like to invite you, Sinan Ezgi, one of the co-founders of our Istanbul. The stage is yours.
I'm not this interesting. Hello, dear guests. Welcome to another edition of our Suare. This is our, as Seda said, this is our first conference, post-pandemic conference at our place, and I'm really happy that we can come together again at last. So thanks for coming. Today's event is a collaboration of our Istanbul with Yeditepe Üniversitesi, and our distinguished guest for tonight, this evening, is Professor Charlie Hailey'i. Welcome. Professor Hailey'i is teaching at University of Florida, where he is also a professor at the School of Architecture. So I would like to give the microphone to our dear friend Ecological to introduce Professor Hailey'i and maybe also tell us some more about today's lecture. Thank you very much. Thanks again for coming.
your permission, I would like to say a few words in Turkish, and then I'm going to invite Dr. Verna to introduce you. Herkese merhaba, iyi akşamlar. Gerçek bir çift dilli akşamdayız. Ben öncelikle Tasarla Yap, yani Design and Build yaklaşımı üzerinden bir konuşma dinleyeceğiz bu akşam. Biz çok önemsiyoruz çağdaş yaklaşımları mimarlık ortamına kazandırmak, bunun üzerinden bir takım deneysel üretim süreçlerini birlikte yaşamak için. Ve Yeditepe Üniversitesi Mimarlık Bölümü olarak Doktor Bahar Aktuna'nın liderliğinde yaklaşık bir sene önce böyle bir karar verdik. Ve bu alanda çalışan dünyadaki birkaç önemli mimar üreticiden biri olan Profesör Dr. Charlie Hailey'i davet ettik. Davetimizi kabul etti. Uzun bir süreç, çok başka bir çalışma ve araştırma süreci yaşadık. Yeditepe Üniversitesi Proje Yönetim Ofisi ve TUBİTAK BİDEB desteğiyle bir araştırma ve workshop süreci yürütüyoruz. Bu sürecin aslında çok önemli iki malzeme sponsoru var. Yutom ve Gerflor Türkiye. Ben huzurlarınızda onlara da çok teşekkür ederim. Mimarlık ortamına, mimarlık eğitimine sundukları katkıdan ötürü. Elbette Aura'ya dair de birkaç şey söylemek isterim. Neden Aura? Elbette Aura. Sadece Aura. Çünkü gerçekten kurumlar üzeri, nitelikli ve mimarlık üretimine dair her şeye ilişkin araştırmaları burada yıllardır sürdürüyorlar. Ben bir akademisyen olarak, bir mimar olarak gururla takip ediyorum ve hem eğitim komisyonlarında olmaktan hem de bir Aura dostu olmaktan ötürü de onur duyuyorum. İlk yüz yüze Aura Suare'de Seda Hanım'la uzun süredir çalışıyoruz üzerinde. Gelen herkese çok teşekkür ederim. Son olarak şunu söylemek istiyorum. Bugün 21. yüzyılda mimarlık üretimi, mimarlık ortamı hiç olmadığı kadar kolektif üretime aç, kolektif üretmek zorundayız. Bir arada işbirliği içinde olmak zorundayız. Aslında Tasarla Yap yaklaşımı da biraz böyle bir yaklaşım. Bu çalıştay içinde çalışan öğrencilerimiz, hem tasarlayan hem çalışan öğrencilerimiz ve onların yürütücülerinin işbirliklerinin sayısı çok. O yüzden işte çok çeşitli disiplinlerle, çok çeşitli konularla küçük bir ölçekte yüzleşmeye devam ediyorlar ve pazartesi günü akşam saat 16'da da Yeditepe Üniversitesi kampüsüne biz bir yapı diyemeyeceğim, bir strüktür, bir mekan aslında bir dış mekan ürünü, bir yerleştirme kazandıracağız. Vaktiniz olursa, bugünkü konferans ilginizi çekerse, üniversitemizin kapıları da size açık, gelip üretimimizi görebilirsiniz. Ben bütün atölye yürütücülerime, başta Doktor Bahar Aktun'a ve bizim davetimizi kırmayıp ta Florida'dan yaklaşık 21 saatlik bir uçuşla aramızda olan Profesör Dr. Charlie Hailey'e, öğrencilerimize şöyle söyleyeyim, sabahladılar, jüriye girdiler ve stüdyo üretimine girdiler. Çok uykusuzlar ama bence yüzleri gülüyor sizlere. Çok teşekkür ederim. Aura'ya ev sahipliğinden ötürü tekrar çok teşekkür ederim. Dio'ya da bu akşamı bize mümkün kıldığı için çok teşekkür ederim. Now I can invite Dr. Verna to introduce Professor Dr. Charlie, and we are looking forward to hear you. Thank you.
So I will do a brief introduction. Charlie Hailey is an architect, apparently, writer and a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Florida. His works deal with emergent built environments and liminal spaces. He received his Bachelor of Arts with a major in architecture at Princeton University in '92, graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a Master of Architecture in '95, worked professionally and collaborated with Jersey Devil before he went for his PhD and got licensed as an architect in Florida in 2000. Received his PhD in design, construction and planning from the University of Florida in 2003. His doctoral work on camps as a way of placemaking has turned into 2 books. The first book, Campsite, was published in 2008 by Louisiana State University Press. Camps, as his second book, was published by MIT Press in 2009. Hailey has 6 published books. I will be naming them. Spoil Island, Reading the Makeshift Archipelago, that was the difficult word, published in 2013. Design Built with Jersey Devil was published in 2016. Slab City, Dispatches from the Last Free Place, was published in 2018 by MIT Press. And it was a collaborative project with photographer Donovan Wiley. And his research on Slab City was funded by Graham Foundation. His most recent book, The Porch, Meditations on the Edge of Nature, was published in 2021 by Chicago Press in 2021. Oh, that's the terms. Hailey has received numerous awards and grants, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Fulbright Scholarship, and he was a Master Artist in Residence at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in 2021. Thank you so much.
So it's wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank Ecological Baba, Bahar Aktuna, and the faculty at Yeditepe University, Burchin, Berna, Aaron, Ezra, Nilai, Jem, and all the students, and we'll see them in a few minutes. And of course, I would like to thank Aura Istanbul for hosting the presentation in this wonderful venue, which I'm so happy to be a part of. So thank you. I'll begin by introducing Design Build as a way of practicing in architecture and in education. Design Build is an activity that combines concept, design process, and ultimately construction. In the process, it melds thinking with making. And I'm somebody who loves to make things. And I at every moment, whether it's mapping something, analyzing something, building a house, building a small thing, which we'll see some small things in the presentation today. And it's not so much that it bridges what is often quite separate, design and construction. It's much more that it finds design in building and building within design. So we might say that it is designing while building. That's why that slash, we were talking about red on the site today, the role of red. That's why that slash between the two, I think it's so important. It holds so much meaning and connection between the two. It talks about how important the process is. This was early stages, probably this is 14 years ago, 15 years ago. One of the first design build studios that I taught at University of Florida. And this was ultimately for an outdoor classroom. And we called this part of the process sketching with wood. We were drawing, tracing the environment. And here we are testing responsiveness, measuring, and essentially finding ways to inhabit the site. This is another view of that project. I like to think about how this combined stages of schematic design and design development. Those kind of early stages of the design process, but converted into something very tangible. Not that as designers we don't do things that are tangible at that stage, but I like it that it became very physical at this stage. And it's a lot like what we did today in the workshop. This is day 2. This was in the morning as we were watching the shade sort of shift around the site. We were sweating, and then we were cooling off, and then we were sweating again. And this really was a kind of process of sketching with wood and sketching with the materials that we know we're going to build with. We don't exactly know what we're going to build yet. We know a little bit. We made some good progress. But it's that it's that process. And here's the team at Yeditepe University. I think most everybody is here today, and I want to thank them for the last couple days, and I'm really looking forward to the next few days. And we have, I guess, 3 more full days, so we'll see what we come up with. But I'm looking forward to that, the process. I'll start with, it would be sort of 2 parts to the presentation. I'll talk a little bit about previous design build projects. That'll be a shorter section, and then I'll talk in the second part a little bit about a project I did while I was on the residency that Berna mentioned last year. This project in Florida is about an hour north of the Gainesville campus, and it's a music pavilion for an African-American community. It's located in a park that's next to a school, and it also served as a memorial to commemorate the teachers at the local school from when education was still segregated. And we came up with these laser-cut names and found ways to put them into the slats to honor those teachers. And in some of the events that followed, it became really like a front porch. And I'll talk a little bit about the typology of the porch in a minute, but it became sort of in that nature. And it also became a kind of back porch, a space that occupies the backside of the building. Again, an idea that I'll come back to in a minute. Another project was an outdoor education facility. It was part of an adventure camp where outdoor adventures were staged, and it's made up of a series of pavilions. To the right is a composting toilet, and to the left is a changing room. And this was built entirely of wood salvaged from a local mill. So we had that constraint. We've talked a lot about constraint in the past couple of days in the design build workshop, and that was one of the really important parts of the project. This was a mobile kiosk for the Office of Sustainability on the University of Florida's campus, and it's towed behind a bike. And sometimes design build can take unexpected turns. In fact, a lot of the times it takes unexpected turns, just like a design project, an architectural project. There are many turns. And that's what happened when we received a donation of 4 200-watt solar panels. Each weighed at least 30 pounds, so we were all of a sudden faced with the problem of how to, and this is be careful what you wish for, right, in a project, of this eccentric weight on something that's being towed behind the bike. And the problem wasn't so much getting enough momentum to tow the solar panels. The problem was this. So we worked a lot with counterweighting. We learned to weld. We made a whole series of adjustments, and we really, in the end, used it to our advantage to provide shade, these wings that went up. We also learned a lot about gears and the ratios of gears. And then lastly, this is a series of projects for the coastal community of Cedar Key. We called this one the Hurricane Stair, and this, I was joking with Bahar, this is the one project that's not on flat ground that we've done, because Florida, as you probably know, is very flat. So I love the project we're working on now for its contours and its slope and its hills. It's a wonderful challenge. And this is really the only project in Florida. This might be the only hill in Florida. It's an ancient dune that is 70 feet high, that's been there for thousands of years. There, as I mentioned earlier, building is a communal activity and one that happens over time. And for our design build classes, this stair project is a place to return to each year. So I have a kind of group photograph each time we visit, and you see the wood changing its patina, its color, and its weathering. So it's really an experiment in the weathering of a project on the coast. So we've kind of studied that as we've gone back. A series of other projects, this one we called Earth. It was all about the horizon. We called this one Sky or Sky Gate, and it was all about framing and all about relating people and place and the near and the far. And these were projects done in conjunction with Philip Tidwell and Sami Rintala, architects in Finland and Norway. So it was also a wonderful opportunity to collaborate. And then lastly, in Cedar Key, this one's closer to, it's a small coastal town. This is closer to the Chamber of Commerce, so it's downtown. The town is all of 500, 600 people, so it's very small. So this was meant to be a part of their communal space. And we studied boat building as a reference to learn to make this project. And this is a detail for a rudder. So we did a lot of analytical drawings. And this is a semester-long project. So it's a little different from the workshop that we're doing. We had that luxury of time to really do these analytic drawings and studies. I mean, we're doing a lot of drawing, but we're not necessarily working with a drafting board or working in AutoCAD. But this was one of the analyses that helped that project along. And it actually became a venue for our final presentation too. And we loved how it transformed, how the presentation of the drawings and the event itself transformed that space. And over so I'll transition now from a series of kind of previous projects to a more recent project to try to unpack this idea of reflective building that I mentioned in the title. So over the past 10 years or so, I've been writing a book on the porch. It came out about a year ago. And at about the same time, as I mentioned, I was artist in residence at the Atlantic Center for the Arts. During the residency, I built a porch that came to be known as the porch without a house. So and I'll talk a little bit about that relationship in a minute. I had been trying to think like a porch. So here I was drawing from the environmentalist Aldo Leopold, who 7 decades earlier had asked readers to, quote, think like a mountain. So essentially, he was encouraging us to think ecologically rather than think individually, and to consider the interconnectivity of our actions. But before thinking too much, I needed to start building. I needed to make a porch. But how do you build a porch without a house? And first, what is a porch? And I mean that both typologically, but also conceptually. Like, what is that type of space? There's vernacular porches that we've studied over the years, particularly in the southern United States. This is the writer Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' porch from the 1930s. This is about 15 minutes south of Gainesville. This is the interior looking one direction. The other direction, this is where Marjorie Rawlings wrote her famous books. We also know porches from modernist interpretations of the air that wraps buildings. And this is, many of you will know this project, this is Rudolf Schindler's Lovell Beach House. And look what happened about 2 years after the Lovells occupied the house. So up on the upper, those are sleeping porches. So the idea, and this was, Philip Lovell he wrote the health column for the LA Times, for the newspaper. And so he was advocating fresh air, but they're right on the coast. It's a pretty brutal environment. So literally 2 years later, they had glassed it in and it became more of a sunroom. So there's kind of another attitude towards air and openness. And it's what happens often when we leave projects, right? When we as designers, we move. This is Rudolf Schindler's own house at Kings Road in West Hollywood. This is one of my all-time favorite projects. This is the first project that he built. And these are its iconic sleeping baskets. You enter here through this wonderful redwood basket, and you move through these concrete tilt wall construction. And it's that tilt wall construction at a domestic scale, which is, I think, so interesting, right? At a very, he built it with one other person. So they cast the concrete on the ground and then with a winch just tilted it up. I don't have a good slide of that, but if you're interested, you'd probably love seeing the process. This is Walter Gropius's house, his first project when he came to Harvard, 1938. It has a front porch and it has a back porch. And here is Gropius playing ping pong on his back porch. It's one of my favorite architect photographs. Porches can also scale up as institutional spaces. Lou Kahn wrote about porches as wrapping ruins around buildings. Here, of course, at the Kimball Museum. And here's Kahn. The order of light tells you that the porch belongs to the sun and the place inside the porch belongs to man. And he also talked about the porch, and again, he's talking about the porch at many different scales in many different ways as an offering to the sun. And here he is at Ahmedabad, the library, that wonderful entry. where he's wrapping air around the building. He's also wrapping what he called ruins around the building. So Kahn lets air make his porches. And he talks about the porch as an opening the building's mouth to breathe. Just one or two other projects, kind of precedents. This is Sigurd Leverance, the Swedish architect. This is the chapel at the Woodland Cemetery. And there's this, and I visited this project for the book, and there's this wonderful, very slight, you can't even see it in the plan, this wonderful slight skew to the entry. And it's literally, I measured it with my foot, and it came down to like half the width of my foot. But it's so significant, that little subtle change. And then Allison and Peter Smithson's, the British architects, their porch for Axel Bruckheisser, the Hexen House. And this, their ideas really influenced some of the research that I've done and also some of the ideas about the porch. And here they say, the porch can be read as an exemplar of a method by which a small physical change, a layering over of air adhered to an existing fabric, can bring about a delicate tuning of person with place. And then this is my all-time favorite architect photograph. Here are the Smithsons as designer builders measuring this very small space, but very significant space for the furniture maker who's standing sort of off to the side and sort of watching the activity. So, with all this as a part of the historical context, the book anchored itself to a very particular porch. It's on a tidal river on the Gulf of Mexico, so on the west coast of Florida. The book is about the architecture of the porch as climatic response. It's also about the porch as a place to actively engage with and respond to climate's changes. That's my sort of most recent research has really tried to understand some of those connections and interactions. So porches tune person and place. A porch absorbs its context as it responds to natural vibrations. The outside comes in, hosts meet guests, and imagination hopefully runs wild. Which is to say that porches hold nature, stories, and bodies. A few weeks before the residency at the Atlantic Center, I wondered what it would be like to design and build a porch that you can navigate, that's what this sketch is about, with your eyes closed, in the dark, during a new moon. So that sounds really specific, but what I mean by that is that we're using all of our senses to navigate this liminal, this edge space. So this was sort of that first sketch and idea to try to understand that. So what is a porch without a house? What is a porch kind of on its own? How do we design for that? And what's the meaning of doing something like that? So I wondered what that was at the beginning of the residency. And then lo and behold, so the second day of the residency, I'm riding around on a bike, taking a break from the campus, and I literally, and strangely enough, there was a porch without a house. And I don't know if any of y'all have, the American architect Paul Rudolph has this wonderful house called the Cocoon House, and it's this catenary curve that he designed for a very modest 1950s house, but it reminded me of that kind of cocoon, that catenary, and that's mainly because it doesn't have a house anymore, right? The porch is responding to it, it's on its own. So it no longer has the house to lean on, but it's creating, I think, this really interesting condition. And the kind of tilt of the walls is actually also a result of that absence of the house. So some porches rely on their houses for support, others like this one find a new equilibrium. So one of my questions was, what is that new equilibrium and what is its connection to the environment? So I needed materials. And I asked 4 materials to traverse the peninsula of Florida with me. Screen material and cedar wood were 2 of the materials. The texture of screen and the smell of cedar evoke memories. I found the roll of nylon screen in my shed. It's moire holds the memory of the roll's curl. And then the cedar wood came from a project with students, but we were talking about this before, that was halted by the pandemic. So it was sort of, had its own memory of kind of stoppage, and it was sort of waiting for a project. It also echoes the cedar forest that surrounds the River Cabins porch and was really local to that part of Florida. It's a forest that's receding at the cusp of climate change, leaving rampikes, which are those dead trees, right? You've probably seen them in coastal conditions where they and the ghost forests kind of are left in its wake. The two other materials are oyster shells and blue paint. The oysters were shucked by hand at a local fish market in Cedar Key, and then gathered from what's called a midden, which some of y'all, it's the pile of used shells. When you walk on them, they groan and splinter. The blue paint lingered in its can after painting the cabin's roof, the porch ceiling. It's the color of a robin's egg, the robin bird that has these really beautiful blue eggs. And there's a name of a paint called robin's egg blue. And there's a tradition of painting porch ceilings that color. Its round window shimmers blue. All of this matter has been repurposed. So all of the pieces came from another project or wanted it to be a project that was recycled. And just to orient you, the Peninsula of Florida, the two locations, you can barely see them with the circles, and then the movement from west to east. On the west is the cabin, on the right is the beach town, New Smyrna Beach in Florida. So here are the materials making their way to the project, landing in the sculpture studio at the Atlantic Center, and still the question of how to build a porch. Had all the material, what's next? It's always the question, right? You've got all the material, you've got everything prepared, and then what do we do next? I started with what the material gave me. 8 feet, 8-foot boards, which is a typical, sort of like the 4-meter or 3-meter boards that we're working with on the workshop. And they were crossing 12-foot boards, which are, sort of the 3 or 4 meters. We've been joking about my inability to convert between English, non-metric, and metric. So it's I'm doing my best. I love metric, and I wish it were in the States. Late into the first night, something emerged, a weave of wood. I started thinking of it as a basket, tired and probably unbalanced from all the clamped boards falling on my head. That's not going to happen to us in the workshop. That was a very, very individual situation. I recalled Rudolf Schindler's sleeping baskets suspended from the roof of the house that he built himself. Then morning came, and then one more evening. I tried building a scale model, but realized I was only mimicking what the one-to-one piece offered. And we kind of felt like that this morning, I think, in the workshop. We were like, we could build a model. We could build a 1-to-20 scale model, but the site is literally right out the door. We have all the wood. Why not build a 1-to-1 model instead? So that's sort of where we are. So I spent it takes a lot of time. As y'all know, all the students, you know how much time it takes to build the models. I started painting some of the screens robin's egg blue, a whole series of studies. And after another night of testing things in the dark, I knew it was time to move outside. I wanted to understand how light and shadow and pattern and reflection played on the screen, both over your head and alongside your body. And all the time I was recalling some of the studies that I had done on the porch on the other coast. These experiments included a scrim that I placed at the front edge of the porch screen a few months earlier. And they reminded me of David Abram's meditation on the living body's boundaries. The boundaries of a living body are open and indeterminate, more like membranes than barriers. They define a surface of metamorphosis and exchange. These are just some of the outcomes of those studies. They also reminded me how Luce Irigaray connects breathing with being. How she says that Martin Heidegger forgot air. And that, quote, what is forgotten is always recalled. It's hard to forget air. We were talking about humidity earlier. It's hard to forget air in a place like Florida, where it either blows really fast or it's really, really saturated with moisture. And it sometimes feels like water, like you're swimming in the air's humidity. Irigaray's is really a philosophy of breath, bridging consciousness and body. I became fascinated with the breathing body and also with the breathing porch. And air really how it becomes a unifying element between the individual and the collective. And I would later find some of these same things in the porch that I was building at the Atlantic Center. And I think that every porch is a place of artistic practice and experimentation with body and light and shadow and texture. And I'm reminded of the photographer Paul Strand's nascent studies, his early studies on his Connecticut porch. Some say the first abstract photograph was born here. That's under debate. It's not an accepted thing, but I find that really intriguing that one of the photographs considered first abstract photograph was born on a porch. I think it's more about Strand's idea that, and this is what he said the world is at our doorstep. We can literally step outside. We can step out from here and really experience much of what we do as architects. This is one other photograph he took. I love this. This is the view of somebody, I think, lying next to a porch, really daydreaming. I can imagine they've just woken up from a little nap and they're watching the clouds move across the sky. On the fourth day of the residency, we chose the site for the porch. The kitchen garden was struggling and decaying. The kitchen is just to the left of this photograph. And the Atlantic Center's chef wanted better access to the herbs and plants for cooking. They literally kind of go out and bring it in for the meal that they're cooking. And I think gardening has an affinity with making a porch. This trellis is much like a porch screen, that original trellis for the garden. And the porch's framing would recall that garden trellis later in the project. So we planted a porch. There are lots of terms for these kinds of boards. Many resonate with the body. Sleepers and footings are my favorite. So sleepers, the idea of this sort of recumbent board in the ground. And then footings, I love that reference to the body, the foundational reference. And here are some of those 12-foot boards. I hardly cut any of the boards, but here's the first frame using the 8-foot boards. I like this moment in the process because it meant teaming up with associate artists to carry and clamp the wood. So it became a communal moment. A lot of this project was unusual for me because a lot of it was kind of individual and reflective, but there were moments of collaboration as well. And the frame gave me a chance to test proportions, offsets, joints. That just one, it looks very simple, but that just as you'll know, right, that detailing process was quite complicated. And this weave of wood framing that moved back and forth, up and down, became the way that I learned the story of the site, its qualities, its phenomena, and its atmosphere. Building paced itself from sunrise to sunset with constant tuning and adjusting, leveling and clamping and unclamping. We've already done a lot of that in the workshop. Raising and shifting. And I came upon this idea of nest as material for imagination. And of course, with that idea, very much comes from Gaston Bachelard. And he talks about the painter, while painting a nest, he dreams of a cottage, and while painting a cottage, dreaming of the nest. For the simplest image is doubled, it is itself and something else than itself. And Bachelard in mentioning painting, and I think about Vincent van Gogh's obsession with nests. We don't see these much, you don't see many of these, but there's that kind of painting and repainting nests. And there's a really mood. We talk a lot about mood these days, and there's a kind of mood to that nest. And also, I couldn't help but think of Kurt Schwitter's the Merzbau projects, which I don't know if you'll know about that, but he built a series of projects in one case in his parents' apartment. So you imagine, having somebody living with you who's basically creating this shell within the space, and it's made up of wood, paper, even some paper mache, and there's all these little reliquaries. Supposedly Mies van der Rohe gave him a pen that he kind of created this little reliquary in the project. As screens were introduced to the frames, I could study their specific orientations, their changes throughout the day in different light and from different perspectives. I'd grown attached to these anthropomorphic, very, very human scale and size, and they seemed to change like mood rings. I don't know if y'all remember the little rings, and they sort of would change with the atmosphere and change with maybe your heart rate, and they would sort of glow, and that's sort of what it felt like. And I think the moire, that pattern, that kind of rippling, mixes the haptic, the sense of touch, with the eidetic, the kind of visual connection. So I found these fascinating on all of those different levels. And in these, I also found what I think are connections with Jasper Johns' studies, the artist, the painter Jasper Johns, studies for skin. And he did these on his porch in Edisto, South Carolina, on the east coast of the United States. This is just a few hundred miles up the coast. That's Johns on the porch. This is one of the, this is a one-to-one painting that Jasper Johns made of that porch. It's called Studio, and he worked a lot on the porch as his workshop. And it actually has a imprint of the screen door, of the threshold and door of the porch. And with charcoal and oil on drafting paper, Johns continued to study light and shadow and texture. And I think Johns is somewhere in that kind of stretching and wrapping of the porch screens. I don't know if any of y'all have ever stretched a canvas, like a painting canvas, but it was very much like that. It was that very physical connection to the material. It's something akin to finding yourself in the material and in the landscape that acts like a mirror. The layers of screen afforded different experiences inside and out, different transparencies, different veiling reflections. I experimented with different layers, up to 3 layers of screen material, and some of it was painted blue, other was left to the kind of gray, the sort of silver, and just trying to study those layering and that separation of the different layers. And there were so many more studies that I want to continue in that vein of the material of screen. And the ceiling at screen membrane was a collective effort. I think we were trying to touch the sky in this moment. And I remember what Ralph Twitchell, an architect, what he said of architect Paul Rudolph, who studied under Twitchell. And he was conflating, kind of mixing drawing and building and reflecting how to make the invisible visible. And he's talking about Rudolph, the architect here. He says he was the one draftsman who tied cobwebs, like spiders' cobwebs, to clouds. And I love that idea of this sort of knitting architecture to the clouds. On the ground and along the porch's eastern edge, I was starting to add oyster shells to the porch entrance. And related to that, there were a series of excursions that we took while we were making the porch. In the early mornings before work, we would often go kayaking in our boats. You saw them in the back of the truck when we were arriving. And on one of those, we kayaked the intercoastal waterway, and these spoil banks, these banks of dredged material, were made up of oyster shells that had been displaced when they made the channel for the waterway. And they also have risen up over the past thousands of years from the indigenous habitation of the estuary. Like those middens that I mentioned are very common in Florida because of all of the oysters that had been harvested and piled up. So there's this visualization of our relationship to that resource, that natural resource. And they evidence the community of native peoples who moved up and down the coast. And many of those, this is one of the middens that I mentioned. It's about 50 feet above sea level. So if you think about just the scale of that and the amount of material, these are all oyster shells. And my hope was that the porch might acknowledge that ground and also gather these histories in the collection of the shells. And also bring near into the presence of the porch those edges of the coast. Also associated the presence of the oysters with the work of Marcel Broutars. In French, the word for mussel, moule, also means mold, like container that shapes something. And so it is a vessel that holds material but also holds air. For Broutars, in his sculptures and in his poems, the mussel became a symbol of potential. And I couldn't resist the porch-sized mussel engraved by Peter van der Heyden in the manner of Hieronymus Bosch, entitled The Oyster Shell, or, and I love this one, merrymakers, like partiers, in a mussel shell. Originally, the shells were also meant to be ballast, holding the porch to the earth. That was one of the early ideas that I had, that they were literally kind of weighting the porch. But I didn't have enough. I didn't bring quite enough. So I later wanted to hint at that through a detail in the floor, hint at that underpinning of the porch. So design build is a process of learning by doing. From this, I've come up with the idea of reflective building, which is drawn in part from Donald Schoen's research on architectural practice. And he talks about the reflective practitioner, the role of thinking in the way that we work as designers. Reflective building is closely linked to embodied craft, which I'm proposing here as a mode of environmental thought. This is closely linked to what David Abram is talking about with the living body and the possibility of reflection. And I came to understand the Porch Project as an embodiment of that continual learning process of reflective building. And again, as I mentioned, it was a pretty individual process with this project, but I think it resonates with the collaborative field as well. Because I was working with, there were 6 associate artists and residents who were working with me, but they were also working on their own projects. So I was more interested in our dialogues about their projects and the thing that I was working on. So it was a really kind of interesting dialogue. And our work with our hands is an important part of that. And here's Juhani Palasma's idea of the thinking hand. It's almost like the brain that is in your hand that kind of guides you in some of your work. During building, the hand helped navigate inside and outside, as well as past and future. And that notch was preparing the wood for a joint in the project that I mentioned that was stopped by the pandemic. And it sort of lived on in this project as a memory of that project. We were designing a memorial for a lighthouse keeper, the first female light keeper on the coast of Florida. We had this design, and anyway, that notch is about the kind of connection. So the hand also helped navigate encounters with far and near textures of cedar inside, here in the foreground, and the bark of the oak trees in the background, that connection between the two. And connections between the hand and the eye and other senses through sketching while building. And a series of, I'll show these quickly, of contour drawings that I included in the book because they were so important in the thinking process of occupying the porch. These are, as you all know, these are also called wandering line drawings. And they're timed to the movement of the hand across the page. So as you're drawing these, you're literally, your eye moving along the contour is timed with your hand moving across the page. And it's very meditative, right? There's a very nice temporal connection. And so sketching was a means of weaving the body to the present. It's an activity of orientation to direction and depth and also time. And every once in a while, a lizard would, we have these lizards all over Florida, and they love like crawling around on the screen. So I love it that we've had a chance to sketch a lot in the workshop. And I think that's such an important part of the immediacy of like the project that we're doing, of the design build. So just those sketches that really start to help guide the project, but also work retrospectively. And looking back, like I look back at these sketches after the project, because they didn't always follow, like I drew up this plan, but it changed when I started building full scale. So it was something where I wanted to study kind of quickly, relationship of the body to edges, but then actually do it, actually go out and study that. So that dialogue between our sketches and what we're building, I think is a really important part. And designing and living in the project as it's built. It's very fortunate when you have that opportunity, right, to actually live in what you're doing. Unless you're renovating your own apartment or house, right? And then it's like, I don't want to be living in my process. So how to think like a porch might be how a porch absorbs its context, light and shadow, the smell of the herbs. This is the planter box. So one of the ideas was that we lifted the herbs into this floating planter box that forms also an edge from a pretty public edge right here. So that was part of that, not barrier, but sort of porous boundary. So you smell the herbs as you're sitting on the porch. And there's a lot of veiled reflections, veiling reflections. I wanted it to be both public and private at the same time. And that was, I don't think I got quite as far as I would have liked, but that was one of the ideas. This is pollen held by the screen. So what I mean by this is how it becomes absorbed by its context. So as I was building, I was constantly kind of moving back and looking at how it was working. And then how you find what you're building in the context where you're working. The things that you don't necessarily know you're associating with as you're building. This is the campus at the Atlantic Center. Thompson and Rose, Charles Thompson and Marianne Rose were the architects. This is where the residence was, and the sculpture studio. And this is the library. This is a corner window of the library. And then this is the porch, the music room, and then looking up to the sky. The board form concrete of the sculpture studio. The spacing of the mortar and the cedar, it was almost serendipitous, but it was something that I really was interested in, kind of finding ways of reflecting that. This is I love this folly of a window into the sculpture studio. And then the kind of, this is looking from the kitchen to the porch. How others see the porch. This is a series of photographs by the artist Juliana Loa, and how other people occupy the porch, and how you periodically return to the porch. Looking at the weathering and growth, this is about 6 months later, and it already started to have that patina. Discovering new aspects and details. And returning to the porch, returning to any architectural project also means repairing. It's not necessarily the callback, like the dreaded sort of callback that we might get of like, this isn't working or this isn't. It was a little bit, but not that bad. But I did have to adjust the roof. And so did a series of kind of adjustments, which was a kind of tuning, further tuning and adjusting. And then I think also thinking like a porch is just sitting on the porch, which sounds kind of mundane, but I want to push that a little further as I wrap up in just a minute. The press that published the Porch book asked me to put together a music playlist for the book, and I'd never done that. Nobody had ever asked me, like, okay, you wrote a book, let's hear the soundtrack. And I was really stumped, and I don't know how good it is. It's not very good, but the middle track is John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds. I don't know if y'all know John Cage's work, but Cage's ideas for this piece came from the time that he spent on a porch in South Carolina with Jasper Johns. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Cage's claim is that we will be able to sit still and simply listen to the sounds which surround us, and we can hear them as music. I don't know if you've ever watched you should watch the YouTube video of the official performance of this. It's wonderful, right? I mean, it's like very official. The guy in the tuxedo comes out and just literally puts this music up on the stand and sits there, and he's like sitting there, and you're waiting, like, is he gonna play? And he doesn't, and he just turns the pages. Like periodically, he's like timing, like he would be playing it. That was, in his thinking, the goal of music. He wrote, I doubt whether we can find a higher goal, namely that art and our involvement in it will somehow introduce us to the very life that we are living, and that we will be able, without scores, without performers and so forth, simply to sit still, to listen to the sounds which surround us and hear them as music. And later, in the 1980s, Cage said that progress in art is, quote, it may be listening to nature. And I wonder if this isn't also related to an idea of radical reflection. Is this perhaps a kind of radical reflection, sitting on a porch? Seems so mundane, but I would propose that sitting on the edge, really, of any building and reflect is a form of radical reflection. And can we also play our porches like instruments? A multi-sensory, immersive instrument. One that takes practice, we have to practice at it, and it also embodies practice. It also holds the idea of practice. And perhaps we can begin to think like a porch. Thank you. I don't know if that left time for questions. I don't know if there are any questions, but I'd love if there's any conversation. But if there's not, that's okay too, because I just really appreciate y'all being here.
Source of online, do we have any questions?
I think silent.
Silence. 4 minutes. So we'll all sit quietly for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. No.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. There's a question in the back, but we can talk later.
I wonder if you ever inspired by Heidegger and his concept about birdness.
About?
Birdness.
Yes. Yes, for sure. But I'm also, yeah, no, I love that idea. I mean, I think I'm hoping that this project and other projects like it really make a place. And I think that's, for me, and Bahar and I have talked a lot about this, but the way that Heidegger talks about, for me, it's about a form of placemaking. And I brought up, I didn't really talk about Heidegger, but talking about Lucia Irigaray, who in a wonderful way, I think, kind of calls Heidegger out. Like she's studying Heidegger and she knows Heidegger, but she's also calling him out a little bit and saying, okay, there's other aspects to maybe beyond being. Maybe she's picking up on Heidegger's later work and talking about becoming and talking about the relationship of, I think, elemental relationship, but she's looking at air, which I think is fascinating, that intangible. And I'm not sure, I think Heidegger probably could have done that pretty well, but I think maybe he wasn't as prepared as somebody like Irigaray to really study that intangible and to bring it into like now, like, you know.
Also, I really liked your works because they look like some kind of Japanese modernist cabinets or traditional modern structures.
Yeah.
And they are very effective. That's a good title, which I like more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I love that connection you made with Japanese architecture, because I've learned a lot from that in proportions, and also I think in the relationship between inside and outside. I think that's something that, I mean, among many other things we can learn from that architecture, but I think, yeah, so thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. I'd love to, any questions even later, it's something I love talking about, so, but I really appreciate y'all being here. Thank you. Thank you.
Değerli dostlar, birazdan içeride yine sohbet edebilir, konuşabiliriz ama sizleri ayağa kaldırmadan evvel birkaç tane bizim geleneksel olarak biliyorsunuz bizi daha iyi hatırlamaları adına bir teşekkür belgemiz oluyor. Dolayısıyla bu akşamın birinci teşekkür belgesini bizi aslında yıllardır destekleyen, bugün de desteğini esirgemeyen sevgili Diyo'ya ve Fatih Bey'e vermek istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim. Tabii bu akşamın burada yapılmasını sağlayan ve Amerika'dan, Florida'dan buraya kadar değerli, kıymetli konuğunu getiren Yeditepe Üniversitesi Mimarlık Fakültesi'ne de teşekkür borçluyuz. Fakülte adına da bunu sevgili Ece Ceylan Baba'ya vermem doğru olacaktır.
Teşekkür ederim. Ben buraya gelmişken mikrofonu alsam.
Tabii, buyurun.
Biz de sevgili Aura'ya, bütün Aura ekibine ve emeği geçen herkese bir teşekkür sertifikası getirdik.
Çok naziksiniz.
Bir kez daha kalkmayalım, siz de görmeyelim diye ben de gerçekten size veriyorum.
Sağ olun Ececiğim, çok mersi. Teşekkür ediyorum. And the last one is for you, Charlie. This is
Thank you.
from Aura,
Beautiful.
remember us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
A picture?
Sure, yes. Thank you.
Kurtul Bey, bir tane de ekiple
Hep beraber,
tabii.
tabii.
Çekilir mi?
All
Selam
together.
mısınız lütfen?
One,
Sure,
all
that's great.
together, yeah.
Great.
Arkadaşlar lütfen.
şansını yazan fazla.
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah.
She's come the first time before you.
Oh, that's great.
Yes,
That's awesome.
very,
No, it's a
very
great question. That's
important.
really cool.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, really great.